Welcome back to Bible study. We are here and we're going to share about the readings for the fourth Sunday in Lent, although we're not going to probably go in much detail on the first readings. We're going to focus mostly on John, but the readings are 1 Samuel and verse 4 through 13, chapter 16, 4 through 13, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8 through 14. The psalm is Psalm 23, and basically we're going to go at the entire chapter of John chapter 9. It's verses 1 through 41. So that's the entire chapter of John. So of that, John chapter 9. We'll go ahead and begin with our prayer. Let us pray. Bend your ear to our prayers, Lord Christ, and come among us. By your gracious life and death for us, bring light into the darkness of our hearts and anoint us with your Spirit. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So I was, on the weekend worship, I was mentioning this is I was saying it was the longest. And then next week, we have the story of Lazarus, which is like chapter 11 in John. I haven't looked at how many verses that is, but I think it's really long too. So maybe I'm wrong, and maybe the story of Lazarus is going to be the longest reading. But at any rate, we've been having some really, really long readings in John, but it's important because it's one whole entire message. And I'll let you know that many also believe, and I've come to accept or go along with this idea, is that actually that you, in a way, to get the whole of what's being conveyed, is that it should continue into chapter 10 in verses 1 through 21. But we're not going to try to do that today. Also, partly because in a few weeks after Easter, we will have some reading from John chapter 10. So I thought, well, we'll get to that a little later. But the idea is that John chapter 10, the first part, talks about Jesus as the Good Shepherd, and that's Jesus' interpretation or commenting on what has happened with the healing of the man who was blind. So that's I think, and the more I think about that, I think, wow, that's kind of, I like that. I can see that can make sense. But we have plenty to try to look at for today. So, but before we get into the reading in a specific way, one of the things that I should know this better, but I saw something that reminded me. Today is March 21st, and that's 3/21, and there is it's been declared a day of honoring or Down Syndrome Day, because trisomy 21 is the designation, meaning in the chromosomes, your 21st chromosome, instead of 2, you always have pairs, right? Pairs of chromosome. What happens for Down syndrome is you have 3. And having that third chromosome is what can make various differences, for the growth of that individual. So this is 3/21, and so it's a recognition of all folks who have Down syndrome, including would be our son Paul being included. So, and this is a story about someone who has disability. It's a different challenge, but so I'm just seeing more ways that trying to be sensitive about maybe various kind of could be a mental challenge, physical challenge, different kinds. Just how can we grow in being sensitive and caring and everything. So, Well, this is a story, and just let me just make one more comment on that before we get into the Bible reading. So one of the things I brought up is people first language. And I even read something again that reminded me about that again today. So I thought, well, let me just mention it again. And that is the notion that instead of, for instance, we'll just talk about Down syndrome in particular. So sometimes people would talk about a person with Down syndrome or a child with Down syndrome as a Downs child, or that person has Downs, or and that's not a good way, because when you put the descriptive situation first, it's almost as if that takes over the whole identity of who the person is. And so people first language is a really much better way to talk about anyone who has, let's say, a challenge with hearing, or a challenge with sight, or a challenge in keeping up with maybe normal development, or typical development, you might say. So like Paul is a young man with Down syndrome. So that's just a way to start to see the person first as an individual, rather than as just lumped into a whole category kind of thing. So in this story, I notice it starts out, it says, he saw a man blind from birth. So that's kind of putting it after the person is first, and then it comes after. But later on, I noticed there is one more place where it says the blind man. And I thought, oh, no, we would try to say the man who, and sometimes it says the man who formerly was blind. And I thought, well, that's good. That's okay. That's an okay way to talk about who this person is. So, all right, just wanted to lift that up. And then let's go ahead and start. And we'll start with John chapter 9. And with the first, I have that little paper broken up. So if you want to start, that's 1 through 5, Barb, if you want to do that for us.
As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's work might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world."
Thank you. So I like to notice that the very first thing is that Jesus is walking along. He sees this man. Well, the man who was blind, that would make it hard for him to see Jesus.
How does he know he's blind?
Maybe, sometimes there are ways a person's eyes appear, that like they're kind of closed, or I'm not sure how. Yeah. We're told a little later that he was a beggar. So
yeah, maybe
it might have been the position where he was in.
Yeah.
Amongst other, I don't know. At any rate, or Jesus just knows everything.
Yeah.
I think that's another thing that in John's gospel, it kind of makes us aware that, like, he talked to the woman at the well, and she said, he asked, "Do you have a husband?" She said, "I have no husband." Yeah. He said, "Well, yeah, I know you've had 5." And he wasn't being derogatory, but it's like, oh, well, okay. Then she's like, "Well, you're a prophet. How you could only know this if you were, someone who was like a prophet." So he clearly knows things beyond just what we can absorb in our normal way. So at any rate, he notices him. And I assume then the disciples noticed Jesus noticing him. I guess that's why it leads them to ask that question. And it was a common assumption in that time. It kind of goes back to Old Testament times. And, there are some passages in the Bible, really the Old Testament, that do indicate that a person who had some kind of illness, or just something that hurt them, we'll just put it in a very broad sense, that somehow that came about because either that person sinned or the parents sinned. And so that was, And the thing is, I can see how that can make sense, and it's not totally wrong, because we know there is cause and effect, and we know that, well, like for instance, if a mother abuses alcohol through a pregnancy, then there's such a thing called fetal alcohol syndrome, which is very real and that affects that child's development. So we know that our choices definitely can have repercussion, but to take that, sometimes, yeah, that's absolutely true, and then say, well, every time there's some kind of limitation or illness, there's automatically a sin connected to that. That's not good logic, actually. That's I'm not good on my philosophers and all that, but I just know that that's just actually not good logic. There's fallacy of trying to work backwards.
And we're all sinners anyway.
And we are all sinners. And that's the other thing too. It's almost like saying, you mean, like we're trying to say, I'm a sinner. Oh, but that person must have sinned so bad that they left an effect on somebody else, Yeah, so our sinfulness does affect not just ourselves and others. That is a broad truth that we all should know and accept. But I think what's also going on here is that sometimes it's just what is, and it's not someone's cause. It's just, in a sense, it's a broader way that creation is broken, that there are things that come along. So anyway, but what Jesus says, and this is how it's worded in this translation, it says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's work might be revealed in him. So I think that's a very good thing to hear at first. What Jesus does say straight up is, neither this man nor his parents sinned. So he really does say, they are not the cause of this. They are not. But this is an opportunity for God's goodness and God's glory to be shown. So he takes it away from, whose fault and, that kind of talk, and say, but you know what? Let's see how God could really act, what God could do in this situation. And so anyway, and then he mentions this phrase, which is kind of a repeat. We call it a running theme throughout the Gospel of John. He says, I am the light of the world. And let's see, oh gosh, I'm not saying, let me get to the beginning of John. There's a verse very early in John's Gospel. It just is like verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5, the light shines in the darkness and the darkness did not overcome it. Talking about Jesus is the light. And then it continues a little bit, verse 6 through 9. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. So it keeps talking about Jesus is the light. He's coming into the world. And then here is a place, and there's some other place where actually Jesus does say it directly. And then there's one more thing I'll just mention here. There are what's called the I am statements in the Gospel of John. And sometimes Jesus is just almost slipped into the wording, like saying, like when he talks again to the woman well, he says, I am he. When she says, we know there is the Messiah coming, Jesus says, I am he. And then other times it's like, I am with another reference, like I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. He says, I am the light of the world more than once. He says, I am the gate for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection of life. I just can't name them all, but there's several times that phrase, I am, comes in again and again and again. And this is one of those places. So
It's more understandable than in the Old Testament when he said, they said, "What should we call you?" And he says, "I am."
I am, yeah.
Period.
That's it. I am. That's it. Yeah. And so what we're getting in the Gospel of John is another way that we're being revealed to us that Jesus and God are like, they are really one. So that Jesus is truly God and truly human, but just kind of lifting up a little more strongly the God side of the connection, I guess you might say. Okay, let's go on. Let's go to the next few verses. So verses 6 through 12.
When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, Is he? Others saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am he." But they kept asking him, "Then how are your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know."
Okay, so throughout this whole story it's a playing along of, he's going to help this man be able to actually see light. We're in a kind of cloudy day here, so we don't have quite as much brightness and all that. But for this person to have not experienced, and then it's hard for me to imagine. I've been in deep caves, like way underground, like let's see, what's the one? It's
California.
yeah. Anyway, Carlsbad Caverns. That's it. That's what I was trying to think of. And then on the tour, at one point, they prepare you, and then they tell you they're going to turn off all the lights, and it's just, it's the darkest. Because even on a night or just, almost anywhere, there's always still some moonlight, some starlight, some, still just some even little bit of light that filters in. And to be in a situation where there was, absolutely no light, and then try to think if that's what you
horrible.
dealt with all the time, Now, one of the things I also appreciate that as going through, some of the commentary about this is, the man cannot see, but I like the point that was made is, but you know what? His hearing was very good, and often, a person who has one limitation, their other senses usually are better, right? And he listens to Jesus, and he does what Jesus says. And so I think of that. I think also in there's a lot of layers in here. So, and there's always more than we'll probably even begin to touch on. But one of the aspects about this story is, I think the man is also an example sort of a disciple to us. So one of the things about being a good disciple is listen to Jesus and then do what Jesus either tells or asks us to do. So I think that would be, part of the growing understanding, like, well, who is a good disciple? Someone who listens to Jesus and does what Jesus says. Again, he was a beggar. He had, again, especially in that day and age, he had so few options. One of the things I appreciate in our time of where we live now is how many more opportunities and how far we have come in ways to help people who might have certain limitation have its accessibility, have ways that help a person participate, be more fully active in life. So like this whole building is all one level, so that if a person doesn't have to negotiate stairs, right? Which yeah, I know. Hey, and you know what? The interesting thing about certain accessibility adaptations is sometimes it's like, you know what? That's kind of nice for everybody. I don't mind not having to, at home we have stairs in our house, but it's not bad to have, sometimes the things are useful for everybody. They can work for everybody. It's not. And then visual things, we've come along with more and more ways that we can help a person work within. I'll try to tell this kind of quickly, but my brother-in-law has retinitis pigmentosa, and therefore his sight has diminished and diminished and diminished. And so my sister and he got to go to Disneyland recently, and they do have special things. So if you have some challenges, they do give you ways to kind of help around that. Only one of them was they found out later, and I thought, oh, that's too bad, because they have it's an audio device, and when you're on a ride, it's telling you about what's going on right here, what's going on here, so that even if you can't see it, you're getting the description of what it is. Yeah. So you're growing and experiencing the ride, but a little differently, but at least you're getting more of a sense, and that they apparently let you ride it again, so that you get to go through it twice, so you can have a better chance to get the sense of what is this about and what's going on here and what's happening now. And the interesting thing in a way is in his work, that's really his main focus in his work with a technology company, is helping develop technology that can then be very useful, so that someone who has sight issues or hearing issues can be able to access things like, if your vision is limited, how do you see the screen? Or do you have a thing that reads it to you, right? So anyway, there's many advances, and I think that's a good gift, and I'm glad that that's available. In the meantime, how Jesus heals the man is, I find, really kind of, to me, surprising. There are a few stories where Jesus does get more close up and hands-on with the healing, but it seems like a lot of times he just says it, right? He just says it, and then that's it. It's all, whatever it is, it's all taken care of, and they're whole again and everything. But here he goes this extra effort of, doesn't sound even nice. He's like, he spits and he makes a little mud, and then he takes that little mud and he smears it on the guy's eyes, and then he tells him, go wash in the pool. And that's where the man is obedient, and that is that's a good example. But it's sort of like, what is that about? And there's all kinds of, but there's different interpretations. But this is my favorite for now. I think maybe it's connecting back to creation and Genesis, where God shapes the earth, and then God brings life to the first human being. So by taking earth and shaping it, but placing on his eyes, it's kind of like the man is becoming a new being. It's like a new creation. He's getting a new life. And so that it might be like Jesus isn't really fully reenacting creation, but it's kind of related to that bringing a recreation to this man, perhaps. At any rate, then when he comes back, Jesus isn't there, so they start to quiz the man, and I always laugh a little bit, like they're kind of pushing him. It's like, well, where is he? And then he said, I do not know. And I always want to say, I don't know. And I always want to say, how do you expect me to know? I couldn't see him in the first place, So, but yeah. So anyway, but the awesome thing is he's healed. He can see. All right, then let's pick up the next little part. Let's do verse 13 through 17. So
They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. And the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." Others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." And he said, "He is a prophet."
thank you. So I think if we just take that perspective of the man is representing being a disciple, is that he knows, he doesn't know everything yet, but he's growing and he's learning, but he will still share what Jesus has done for him. He won't be like afraid, so he's willing to share that. He doesn't just like, get in awe of these authoritarian people and just like give in to them. No, I feel like it's also he's growing and knowing who Jesus is. So he's kind of like the woman at the well over the course, but in their case, it was a conversation. In the case of the man with blindness, or who formerly was blind, now we should call him, it's people's questions at him that actually seem to help him keep growing stronger, even about really trusting Jesus, or I don't know if we could call it believing in Jesus until later on he actually meets Jesus, but he's just growing and understanding more and more that Jesus has done something in my life that has changed me, and I want to know more. I'm not going to give up on this, so that's one aspect of this next part of the encounter. So the Pharisees are, sometimes in the Bible readings, they come off as almost like always the bad guys. But that's, it's important to keep in mind. I think there were just certain ones of them that had grave doubts about, but maybe they felt threatened by Jesus. It would be a threat to their authority, their status, threat to the way of life that they knew, so they wanted to push back. But it does even say in this passage right here, it says some said that, he's bad, Jesus must be bad, he did this on the Sabbath. And then others are like, well, but a sinner couldn't do such things as this. A sinner couldn't perform such a sign as this. And they were divided. So I think that's important to keep in mind, because again, sometimes we just might get this, like there is a song that is sung during Camp Hope with the kids, and I just want to be a sheep, ba 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 ba. It's just a cute, fun camp song. And then in one of the verses, I don't want to be a Pharisee because they're not fair, you see, and just plague up. But again, I like to just step back sometimes and say, look, is not fair. It's just not fair to lump a whole bunch of people of anything, like a stereotype or something. So not all of them were that way, but some were definitely worried about Jesus growing popularity, I guess maybe you could say. So, all right. Then again, but he never sticks to it. He won't back down, he won't make them afraid. He won't let them make him afraid. And then he, just like the woman who comes to her own kind of new insight, this man says he is a prophet. And prophets from the Old Testament, I know we tend to think of prophets as those who do give God's message. but sometimes it is future oriented. But there's other stories about them doing miracles, So it wasn't that prophets only just gave God's message and that's all they ever did. Yeah, there were miraculous things that they were God's agent to bring about that miraculous thing. So that's pretty powerful, that the man now he's kind of raising his conception of who Jesus is. So he states that he is a prophet. So, all right, let's go to the next portion. Let's see this. Now this on our little page, we have to turn over. So it's verse 18 through 23. So that's next part. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We don't know, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I don't know. Part of this makes me think about, and it's unfortunately we're in another time where I think people get really, really set, just like I know the truth, and nobody is going to change my mind, and I'm going to keep doing anything I can to prove my perspective, and we got a little bit of that going on this day and age, and it doesn't matter what political party you're on. I think anybody can get really into this, and so they're trying to find another way to get around this man's witness. They're going to try to disprove. They're going to try to, question his honesty, right? Like, this guy must be lying. That's So let's find his parents. They'll tell us, and they're hoping the parents are going to admit that that the guy really did see, and that this was all a hoax, and so they call the parents over to interview them, and then they admit, they say, "No, I'm glad they're at least brave enough to say he was blind from birth. It's been his whole life, And then this part about, but they all wanted to go now, go ask him. They kind of wanted to get out of this as soon as they could. They were kind of nervous about this. So something about the Gospel of John. Excuse me a sec. The earliest gospel written was Gospel Mark, somewhere mid 60, 65 after AD. Then the next, Matthew and Luke came a little later, but the Gospel of John was the last of the four Gospels. And it came towards the end of the first century. And when the other Gospels were written, and I think the book of Acts we would say also, mostly the Christians were within the synagogue, mostly. If you go in the book of Acts, even though Paul was there to reach many towards the Gentiles, most every time he comes to a new city, he first goes to the synagogue. He starts there. And people who started to accept Jesus as Messiah, they were members of the synagogue. And so initially it was within the synagogue. It was like a little, difference of some belief, but they were still together. But this was later on, and the differences were starting to be stronger. And I would say it wasn't just that the Jews were saying to those who chose to follow Jesus, say like, well, you got to get out of here. I think even those who were followers of Jesus were like, this is too hard. It's too hard to worship and do the same anymore. So I don't know that it was the one was only being cast out. I think it was a time though when this separation was actually becoming more so. So at any rate, but there was some truth in that. Sometimes people were like, "That's it, you've gone too far. You're, out the door." That did happen sometimes. So they're like, "Go talk to him. He can speak for himself. Go ask him." So they continue, and again though, I think if I want to put this towards myself and try to reflect, do I close off that God may act sometime or work through some people that I would initially have said, oh no, that's impossible, and instead can I be open enough to the Spirit to see that, well, okay, so maybe God acts in a way that is surprising to me with people that I wouldn't have thought initially or something, but to be open enough to say, okay, I guess God is working there, and I just didn't notice it or realize it at first. So not to be so tunnel vision like some of these leaders were being, as we'll see, because there's some of them are just like, they're just not gonna give up, right? Okay, so then we are in verse 24 through 34. It's a little longer. I'll do this one. Okay, so John chapter 9, 24 through 34. So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." And they said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. So again, there's a strong resistance there. But again, I just always just try to step back, and instead of only be like, well, look at those bad, I'm like, don't, make sure you don't have your own blinders on sometimes, All right, so they, but also again, think of this man's growing, how he seems to get stronger and stronger and standing up for what he knows is true and talking about Jesus with great commitment, and again, not letting them push him around. It's like, if you think about this, a person who's been a beggar, who's had to just, meekly hope that people will because if he couldn't even see, all he could do is like this. I could probably hear a person's approaching, but he didn't have, he had so little control in his life. And here he gets seems like he just gets stronger and bolder. I think it's amazing. And that's not to say that everybody has to be like that. I'm going to go tell everybody I'm going to be like that, but to not be averse to sharing. If there's an opportunity, we need to have at least a certain amount of boldness to be willing to profess faith in Jesus, and as this man was. And they're just confused. There's again, there are some Bible passages that sort of do reference that that God would not listen to sinners. But it is interesting because on the other hand, of course, we're all sinners. So I always do look at that too and kind of go, I kind of get what it's saying, but at the same time, we're all sinners. So, anyway. But the thing is that
these people didn't have the background we have.
Yeah, and we've had a lot more.
You would feel in a situation like that.
Well, and we know the whole entire story. We know the fullness of what Jesus finally did. He goes to the cross, and there is the resurrection. I mean, this is still before that, so they don't. We see the whole picture. They don't. So yeah, we shouldn't. And anyway, we'll get to a little bit more of it. That's so again, what I really appreciate in this portion is his commitment, his willing to speak what he knows to be true about Jesus and not let other people, but I don't want to say like being arrogant either. I don't think that's the right way either, but just to know and be sure and be confident. And that if someone's asking you, and the other thing I also appreciate about this course of what happens with the man is that I think facing challenges to faith can be a way that we can grow in faith. It can actually, I think, ultimately can help us grow stronger. And so I feel like that is also an example of that can be part of life. That and I feel like in my life there's been times where I've gone through things that were challenges to faith, but ultimately then over time and looking back, I'm like, but you know what? It did make me stronger in faith. So I think that's kind of a good lesson to remember. All right, a little more, and we're almost there. So this last little bit. So when I split this apart, there are some who suggest, and I went ahead with that, is that this is actually 7 parts. So we have just a little more about Jesus finds the man, and then there's one little more encounter with Pharisees. So if you'll pick up verse 35 through 39, Barb.
Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind."
Yeah, I know. So the first part of that reading, we're like, yay!
Yeah.
And the next part, you kind of go, oh. Yeah. There are some that talk first a little bit about that second part. He said, "I came to the world for judgment, so those who do see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Now he's talking metaphorically, right? But there are some other passages in the other Gospels too that talk about like making kind of a stumbling block. Of course, that's quoting from Isaiah, so it's not new. It's actually been said before. And I think, I still strongly believe that it is God's desire, because that's God so loved the world that whoever, so God's desire and intention is that everyone could believe and everyone could know Jesus. So that I do not think God ever wants anyone to be cut off. But I think sometimes when people are being extra stubborn, sometimes you kind of have to, it's like the prophets, or then Jesus was sometimes, he spoke stronger to those who were more blind in the sense of spiritually blind. And so I think sometimes you have to push back kind of harder. But just like the prophets in the Old Testament, sometimes they were like, but the purpose, the goal, ultimate goal was to have them then be repentant, so that they would come to repentance. So sometimes it's the strong words, but the goal is ultimately come to repentance. So I like to think of it that way. But at any rate, back to the first part of that passage, which is, I love this part a lot. So Jesus now appears. He was there. He healed the man. We haven't had him around for quite a while, but he learns that this man has been cast out, and so he goes and seeks him. And that definitely might bring to mind things like, the shepherd who goes and looks for the lost sheep. So, in a sense, that's Jesus as being a good shepherd, as we're going to hear in chapter 10. He's being a good shepherd. And then he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And then the man says, well, who? Let me know. I want to believe. And he says, you have seen him. He doesn't say I am this time, but it's almost exactly like when he's talking with the woman at the well. And she says, oh, the Messiah. Well, this here is the Son of Man. It's another term for, one who is God's special servant. It's, there's just different ways of expressing it. At any rate, the point is, he meets Jesus, and he becomes in relationship. He comes to believe, and not just believe, but worship. So again, think of this man as an example for us for discipleship, is to know Jesus, trust Jesus, profess Jesus, but then here believe and worship Jesus. So there's kind of a whole good picture that is given to us here through that. And then the last little bit, I'll just read it. It's just the last couple of verses of this, and it kind of like what Jesus was just saying. It says, maybe I should have kept verse 39 with the next part, but anyway, some of the Pharisees who were with Jesus heard this and said to him, surely we are not blind, are we? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not have sin, but now that you say we see, your sin remains. And again, it's that assumption on certain of those Pharisees' part that they knew all the truth and that they could never be wrong. And with that strong conviction, it's like spiritually they're blind. There's the famous hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. And, the story of that is the man was a slave trader, and you could say he was blind to the cruelty of that. And later God opened his eyes, and he understood how wrong that was. And then he became one who tried to serve God, serve Christ, make a positive impact in the world. So it was a spiritual, becoming right with God, but it also made him say, I can't do that anymore. I can't sell people into slavery. So having your eyes opened in a certain way, but spiritually can lead to, changes in life and how you treat people and everything. So, well, thank you. Let me just do one verse from the Samuel story. It is the story of calling David to be anointed, sending Samuel to anoint David to be who will become the next king. And he sees all David's brothers, and God says, not that one, not that one. And then he says to David's father, well, do you have any other sons? Because he knows God sent him there to find one of Jesse's sons that's supposed to anoint them to be the next king. And a future king. It's not like instantly. And so he says, well, I have this one more son. Well, he's out taking care of the sheep. He's just a shepherd boy. Well, call him, tell him to come here. And so David comes, and he's the youngest. So he's not very, I mean, I don't think he was like a little kid, but he might have been like a young teenager, I think is probably about right. So he wasn't like fully grown yet. And then God reveals like, yeah, but when Samuel thought all the big strapping guys were the right one, God says to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. That was one of the older brothers. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And I think also the Lord looks on the heart. And I think that really fits very well with the story of the man who was born blind. So let's, should we share in our Lord's Prayer? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may you have a very blessed week.
Thank you.